Hi, this is Mark Anderson, and just for English 7, going to talk for a little bit about Chapter 2 because it's traditionally been a chapter that makes for some thorny reading. One of Appiah's strategies in laying out his philosophy is to give some examples, both hypothetical and from the real world, to illustrate his points. So this can sometimes lead us on some tangents and create some difficult places to actually track. So I just wanted to point out a couple of key points that you should come away with Chapter 2 from and some possible misunderstandings. And I think this will help you respond to the chapter and use it in your future writing too. So first of all, the first thing I wanted to point out to you were a couple key terms that we'll be using all semester. First, there's relativism and universal morality. And the way he talks about those terms is by first talking about cultural anthropologists, this academic field that started a little more than 150 years ago, in which people go and study someone else's culture. And what the cultural anthropologists develop over time was this sense of moral relativism. And so, what they mean by that is there's not one way of deciding right or wrong that's true throughout the whole world. So maybe in Europe for hundreds of years, the church had taught the church is the arbiter of what's right and wrong, and that's a universal morality that would apply to anyone around the world. But these academics, these cultural anthropologists, actually spent time in other cultures and began to argue that morality is not some universal morality, but rather that right and wrong are relative, and they're relative to particular customs depending on where you are raised or depending on the ideas that exist in your culture. And so that's what cultural relativism means, or moral relativism means, that we're not necessarily bound to some universal morality. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward, right? These two terms. Universal morality means that there's one set of laws that applies to everyone around the world, whatever your culture is. Cultural relativism, that that our ideas of right or wrong are really shaped and they depend on what culture we're in. Where it gets tricky is he transitions well, to be exact, he transitions on page 17 to talk about positivism. So to understand what he means about positivism, first track what he's saying about the Enlightenment. In European philosophy or the history of European thought, there were, for many years, what was seen as right and wrong was determined by the church. Whether it's the Catholic Church or later the Protestant Church, they were declaring that these things are right or wrong. So the famous example was the Catholic Church condemned Galileo for saying that the earth revolves around the sun. The Catholic Church argued that the sun revolves around the earth. And so the Catholic Church was basically saying, hey, whatever we said goes. During the Enlightenment, thinkers began to challenge the church's monopoly on truth, and instead they said, no, to find out something's true, we need to test it, we need to observe it in the world, and use rational thought to deduce things, whether they're real or not. And so out of this enlightenment, this move from just saying whatever the church says is true to actually using science and reason to figure out what's right or wrong, we get these two sets of ideas that Appiah goes into, and I think this is where it gets tricky. He says that according to enlightenment, you can kind of break down our ideas about the world into facts and values. Facts are the things that exist in the world, right? So a fact might be that the earth revolves around the sun. That's something out there in the world that's not within us. It's something we can observe and use observation and reason and logic to prove that the earth travels around the sun. Values, on the other hand, are things that we believe are important and that we hope for the world, but they don't exist in the world, and so therefore they're very personal and they might vary from person to person, and it's hard to prove that one set of values is more important or better than another set of values. Then he transitions into the terms which I think are confusing, beliefs and desires. I think they're confusing because usually we mean belief like belief in God, or I believe in freedom. Here he means something totally different. Here he means beliefs is what you believe to be true about the world. So an example of this would be I believe that human action is causing global warming and has been causing the earth to heat up over the last couple hundred years because of increased carbon emission, right? So that's more in the line of facts. These are things we can observe, use some scientific tools, use some reasoning to prove that this belief about the world is true. It's not a belief like I believe in God, which might be a little harder to true, or I believe in love, which these could be hard to true. He's saying beliefs about facts. And then in contrast, he says values are really desires. It's not what you believe exists in the world. Desires are your values, what you hope to be true for the world. So a value might be, I hope for everybody, I desire for everyone to be kind to each other. That might sound reasonable and even attractive to you, that everybody would be kind to each other, but it doesn't exist in the world. It's what I want to be true for the world. Okay, so that's the difference between beliefs and desires. Now here is where he gets into what this leads to in terms of thinking of ethics or right and wrong from a positive perspective. For a positive, we can only claim that beliefs are universal, right? It doesn't matter about your culture or what your cultural beliefs are or not when it comes to global warming. It's either happening because of human impact or not. Or it doesn't matter what your cultural background is when it comes to something like the earth revolving around the sun. It doesn't matter what your cultural background is. That is a fact that exists in the world. So my belief that the earth goes around the sun can be proven and supported. However, our desires for how the world should be, if I think everybody should be honest, or if I think everybody should be kind, those desires don't exist in the world. They're my idea of how the world should be. So they're very difficult to prove and to follow some line of reasoning or to gather evidence that proves my desire. And we can even take it politically, my desire for universal health care or my desire for a capitalistic system. It's hard to prove those things. So then just go with me one more step. Positivists say we can come to consensus on beliefs. So we can come to consensus that the earth goes around the sun. We just gather enough data and evidence and explain it well enough and people would agree, okay, the earth goes around the sun, because they're based on testable facts. But when we can't come to consensus on is our desires, our hopes for how the world should be. You may sympathize with me when I say everybody should be kind to each other, but that idea doesn't exist in the world, so we could never prove it to be true. So, well, what happens is a lot of readers, a lot of my students end up thinking that Appia is saying that the positivists are right. However, be careful, because notice on the last section that begins on page 23 is called Positivist Problems. So as a reader, that signals to me that Appia has set up, here's what positivists think, but now he's going to critique some of their ideas. So here he breaks down the distinction between beliefs and desires. And he goes on to show that many things that we think of as beliefs, as facts, like the color that we see on a fire truck is red, that's actually not a fact that exists somewhere. And we'd be hard pressed to prove the redness of a fire truck. So this is specifically on page 24 when he gets into this argument about color. That's where his logic starts stretching my ability to follow him and often my students' ability to follow him. So I have to reread that bit on 24 a bit. That's a clunk for me. So then he goes on to argue that desires or values, no, they're not objective. We can't go out into the world and find the importance of kindness anywhere. But that doesn't mean but that also is true that doesn't mean we just get to make up any values that we want, right? Like, so yeah, we can't go out and find the fact that kindness is an important value out there in the world, but that doesn't mean I can go around saying, oh, cruelty is more important and a better value than kindness, right? I can't make that up. And a society doesn't just to make that up if they want to. So he goes on to say that while there's not a rule book on everything that's right or wrong in the world, we can and should come to some important agreements about values. We shouldn't just leave it as the positivists do. And the positivists, he says, just say, oh, well, you can't prove one thing's right or one thing's wrong, so who knows what values are important. So he says we can't leave it there. We can come to important agreements about values, and to say, as the positivist does, that all values are just relative based on your culture or based on your personal preference, he ends by saying, that might sound like it's tolerance, or that might sound really open-minded, but he says in actuality it just is a conversation starter, because you can always end any conversation by saying, oh, well, you think kindness is important, I think cruelty is more important, and that's just my point of view, those are my values, and those are your values, and we can just end the conversation there. And so he goes on to say that conclusion of the positivists is not very helpful. Okay, so that's chapter 2. Hope that listening it, seeing a couple of those illustrations that go along with it, helps to clarify some of what went on in chapter 2, and we'll follow up next time in class.